Let me start with a disclaimer. I'm not an apostle, prophet, teacher, pastor, or evangelist. Who I am is a child of God, saved by His grace through His Son Jesus Christ with the Holy Spirit living inside of me. I wasn't raised in a Christian home. On the contrary, I was a Buddhist for 2 decades before I was born again. We all know the term cognitive dissonance. For me, the experience of being born again is the most profound and incomparable event of my entire existence of almost 6 decades of life on this earth. Jesus gave His life for us. The least we can do is give our lives back to Him and do whatever He tells us to do. If you clicked on this video, I believe you already either believe that we are living in the end times or you are at least curious about the end times. Most people believe the end times are here and that we're not talking about some futuristic era 5 decades from now, and I believe that as well. However, where exactly we are in the end times timeline is something people understand very differently, and I think that that difference often depends on how much we have been influenced by the teachings we have received throughout our walk with Christ, including the denomination or non-denomination we belong to. Cognitive dissonance can be very powerful. What if we don't allow our denominational teachings to become strongholds? What if instead we allow the Holy Spirit to guide us into all truth, even when that truth turns out to be different from what we have been taught? I, for one, have always believed that the book of Revelation, Matthew 24, Daniel 7, and Ezekiel 38-39, the war of Gog and Magog, were primarily describing events that were still in the future, and I've been looking forward to seeing these things fulfilled in our day and in the very near future. But what if they aren't? What if what Jesus told His disciples in Matthew 24 was actually referring to events that would happen within their own generation? Jesus told His disciples that the temple they were looking at would be destroyed. He then described tribulation events that they would experience before His return. And then in verse 34 that we see here, He said, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. We know that the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So what if Jesus really meant that generation, literally? What if the tribulation has already happened? We know how severe the persecution was that Peter, James, John, and the other disciples faced after Jesus left. What if those events were part of that fulfillment? And what if the rest of those prophecies have already been fulfilled as well, including Christ's return and the 1,000-year reign that followed? Now, I'm not saying that I wholeheartedly believe this. I'm still wrestling with it pretty much. I'm still in that place of cognitive dissonance, and I'm seeking the truth, and obviously I still have questions. But there is an eschatological view, sometimes people refer to it as the little season eschatology, that argues that what Jesus described in Matthew 24, along with the events described in Revelation from chapter 1 through chapter 20 up until verse 6 have already been fulfilled. If that interpretation is correct, then we are now living in Revelation chapter 20, verse 7 and onward. So actually, let's go read that. Revelation chapter 20, verse 7, it says, when the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and then will go out to deceive the nations in the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. According to this passage, Satan is released for a little season and goes out to deceive the nations, leading them toward the war of Gog and Magog, which is in Ezekiel 38-39. Then Satan will be defeated again and thrown into the lake of burning sulfur. As we can see, there is a lot of misinformation and deception in all areas of society, including science, medicine, education, history, politics, religion, and many other fields, especially in this century. If we read further down, we'll see after the war of Gog and Magog, Satan thrown down, then comes the great white throne judgment, right? We see here in verse 11 and 12. We can also see what appears to be a connection between this passage here and in the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 7 to 11. So let's go read Daniel 7, verse 7 to 11. It says, after that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast. And then this beast had 10 horns, and then there's a little horn that came up, and after the 3 of them were uprooted. And then after that, it's the scene of the great white throne judgment here, verse 9 and verse 10, right? These two passages have the same sequential order of the events. Here's the crazy thing, you guys. I believe we are in the middle of seeing the fourth beast that we just read forming. I've been following on and off the 10 horns of 10 nations forming for a few years now, and there are many alliances formed like EU Big 3, G4, E5, which is now G6, and G7, and G12, which is now 13, and G10, which became G11, and their formation purposes are close, but not quite. However, looking at what's happening in Israel right now in 2026, along with the 3 nations that have recently formed in the Middle East, I believe 7 more around that area will join as the war continues and the economy remains unstable. I believe these 10 nations in the Middle East will remain as the 10 horns, and then 3 of them are going to bail out, and 1 little nation will rise as little horn out of them. That will put us right here in Daniel chapter 7, verse 7 through 8. Now, I'm not saying that this is definitive. It could still change, but it looks like it's coming together. After all, the center of everything is always around the Middle East, particularly the area surrounding Israel rather than other continents. There's a brother also doing the video on this. So here's the question I'm wrestling with. What if this little season eschatology is true? Would we live the rest of our lives differently if we came to believe it? And if we would, shouldn't that make us examine what we currently believe? In theory, we should plan our lives as if Jesus isn't coming back tomorrow, but we should live our lives as if he could or he would, right? But if we look around, I'm not sure that's how many Christians actually live, especially those who believe in pre-tribulation. Instead, some seem to plan their entire lives around an escape route. Every sign, every eclipse, every major event becomes another possible sign that Jesus is coming back on that particular day. Some people have already mentally left this earth, right? They have already checked out. They are focused on escaping rather than reaching the people who are still here. And I want to make something clear about where I personally have always stood. I have never believed that Christians are simply going to be raptured out of here before any tribulation happens. I have always believed that as followers of Christ, we may have to go through tribulation, persecution, suffering, and difficult times before we are getting out of here. Jesus himself told his disciples that in this world, we will have tribulation. He never promised us a life without suffering. In fact, throughout scriptures, we see that God's people often had to endure hardship while remaining faithful to him. So for me, the question has never been, how quickly can I escape this world? The question has always been, how do I remain faithful to Christ no matter what happens? If tribulation comes, I want to be prepared to stand. If persecution comes, I want to be prepared to remain faithful. And if Jesus comes back in our lifetime, like tomorrow or today, I want to be ready for him. We shouldn't plan our entire life to revolve around escaping hardship. We should plan it to revolve around following Jesus, loving people, sharing the gospel, and remain faithful regardless of what happens. So here's where I stand. If you are someone who is genuinely seeking the truth, even if that means being willing to admit that the doctrine you have believed your entire life might be wrong, you have an opportunity to discover what God actually meant by his word. But if we become so set in our doctrines that we believe the doctrine that we hold so dear is the only possible correct interpretation, we may close ourselves off from discovering the fullness of truth. I'm not saying that we should abandon everything we believe. What I'm saying is we should be willing to search. We should be willing to seek out the truth. We should be willing to ask questions. We should be willing to say, Lord, if I'm wrong, show me. Because ultimately, I don't want to defend a doctrine. I want to know the truth. And if the Holy Spirit is truly the Spirit of truth, then we should trust Him enough to lead us, even when He leads us somewhere we didn't expect to go by our own intellect. Do you agree or disagree? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your opinions, and thank you. May we all seek Him and seek His face like never before.